School Inc., A Personal Journey. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is Bookmarks. Welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. The U.S. public school system has been a political football for decades. Some school reform and advocates point to innovation in other sectors of American life and wonder why the education system has not made similar strides. This is the subject of a new documentary, School Inc., A Personal Journey, by the late Andrew Coulson. Here's part of the trailer.
In the modern world, we ride the crest of a wave. Every day, innovators discover new and better ways of meeting our needs. The greatest innovations are routinely replicated worldwide, except in education, which has remained stubbornly at anchor while the rest of the world has sailed past it.
In the next hour, policy analyst Andrew Coulson explores why our classrooms have yet to be transformed by a similar wave. The same kind of innovative wave that has revolutionized and improved every other aspect of our lives. We crisscross the globe in our search for answers to the essential question: how do we attain educational excellence?
Sadly, Mr. Coulson lost his battle with cancer in 2016. However, his close colleague and collaborator on the film, Neil McCluskey, joins us today. Dr. McCluskey is the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute and a former policy analyst at the Center for Education Reform. He is author of Feds in the Classroom: How Big Government Corrupts, Cripples, and Compromises American Education. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Forbes. He has appeared on C-SPAN, CNN, the Fox News Channel, and numerous radio programs. And joining us via Skype to critique the film is Gary Miran, Professor of Evaluation, Measurement, and Research at Western Michigan University. Dr. Miran's research interests include private education management organizations and efforts to create systemic change in urban and rural schools. He has prepared and directed more than 60 evaluations and research studies and has conducted 9 comprehensive evaluations of charter school reforms, among other studies related to school choice reforms and charter schools. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Neil McCluskey, could you give us in a nutshell the main thesis of this film?
Sure. The main idea of this film is to try and explain how we take advantage of sort of free markets, of free people voluntarily interacting with each other, and it produces really tremendous outcomes in all sorts of aspects of our lives. And what Andrew Coulson saw was it's a system that we don't embrace in education. And what the purpose of School Inc. is to show viewers both how free markets work outside of education, how they have at times been allowed to work to some extent inside education, and to illustrate to people why we should want free markets in education, why we should embrace them, and why we shouldn't be afraid of even things like profit, which people hear about profit in education and they sort of instinctively pull back and they say, well, wait a minute, we don't want that. And so this explains, in very friendly, sort of entertaining terms, why these are all actually good things and they're beneficial, and why we shouldn't say they don't go with education. In fact, they are really crucial if we want a dynamic, innovative education system.
And Gary Miran, what is your critique of the film?
Well, I found it entertaining. I found it very persuasive. At the same time, I found it very dangerous. Basically, as Neil pointed out, there is a purpose behind the film, which is to promote understanding and also promote the notion of private entrepreneurial endeavors in the public school sector. And unfortunately, they went in search of anecdotes that fit that purpose, and it is one series of anecdotes. And there are some issues I'd like to take up about some falsehoods in this, and also I'd like to talk more about the case countries that they selected, because just selecting individual schools and not looking at the larger school system and the impact isn't really a very effective or a good way to drive education policy, but it is a good way to drive an agenda. Mr.
McCluskey, what's your response?
Well, I don't think it's dangerous, because I think these are actually excellent ideas. But in fact, it does talk about the research in entire systems. Certainly illustrations are done with looking at school systems, not national school systems, but school networks and things like that. But I think it's incorrect to say that there isn't also empirical information in there.
Can you give us one example of your concerns were of a country, a specific country? Do you have a specific country that you're concerned?
Let's take Sweden. I mean, we bring up the example of 2 for-profit companies, and there was very happy music, and there's happy children. These schools, they've been involved in a lot of corruption, and they're in the news quite extensively, and then to have this very positive presentation. There are other anecdotes I know that would have been probably also positive without the scandal-ridden past. But I mean, when we look at Sweden before these reforms in '93 is when they were implemented, Sweden was in the top half of the OECD countries consistently in the OECD as an organization for economic cooperation and development. And they keep statistics and administer these international assessments on student learning. And Sweden was in the top half consistently. And since 1993, Sweden has been dropping. In the most recent PISA, they're ranked 28th out of 34 countries. And scholars in Sweden, and none of them were spoken to, they've all come to the consensus, like the OECD, is that the implementation of this privatization in Sweden has led to this collapse of the public schooling.
Andrew Coulson talks about, absolutely, Sweden has seen this drop in PISA scores. And he explains that people have tried to make this connection and say, well, it's because of privatization, but they often miss some very important things, including the change in the pedagogy in most of the public schools. And so certainly people can debate which of these factors is most important. But to say that this documentary suggests that it doesn't deal with these questions is just wrong. I mean, if you look at the documentary, he talks a great deal about it. He talks about Chile. And people said, look, Chile has this problem of that it leads to splitting of people, and it socioeconomically, that it's sort of unfair, that it leads to inequality. And he talks to researchers about what the research shows in that. So I think it's really wrong to say that this doesn't have a research basis. Not only does it have a research basis, it's dealt with in the documentary.
Well, does the documentary actually point out how they solved some of these issues?
It doesn't say that, for instance, the most recent things that we've seen in Sweden, for instance, that there's been this change in the pedagogy in public schooling. It says some of the private schools embrace this more progressive pedagogy, some don't, but it doesn't try and say that it has transformed changes that we've only been seeing in the last 10 years or so. What it does do is say, look, we're told when people don't want to look at the full picture often that we know Sweden's done badly because they started to decline in PISA around the same time that they moved toward private education and vouchers. But there are other factors involved, and this says, look, these other factors are important.
And what's your response?
Well, Neil said earlier that, this documentary, this movie is, people can watch it and they can make up their own opinion at the end. Andrew doesn't present the critics. There's not a single interview of a critic there. Yes, he does paraphrase what he thinks the critics would say. In Chile, he says there's critics. He says there's people that oppose it. And he says, but they're communist. In Sweden, he says, yes, there's some critics, but it's really, he says it's about the teacher quality and so forth. But there's a number of scholars in Sweden he could have interviewed. He doesn't interview them. I don't hear their voices. I hear him paraphrasing if there's any criticism. But this is a film, 3 hours, and we don't hear anybody from a successful traditional public school. We don't hear any critic of these anecdotes. We just hear the people who have records of scholarship that support these things, and we don't hear the critics.
Yeah, but none of that's hidden in the documentary. I mean, it's called A Personal Journey. It's quite clear from the title that this is Andrew Coulson's, his documentary. It's his thought process on what's important. And in a way, the documentary is itself a counter to what most people, what we've all grown up with. I mean, most people, 90% of kids in America, school-age kids now, go to public schools. Most people have gone to public schools. We're under the impression that often that the only effective way to deliver education is through a government-supplied model. And so in a way, this is the counter-argument to what people have grown up with. And I don't think that he tries to give the impression that there aren't other views. Again, it's right in the title that this is a personal journey. So there's no effort, I think, for him to say, look, I am presenting all the evidence. No, he's very clearly presenting an argument and evidence to support it, but that's his opinion.
Well, we could go on to KIPP, and in KIPP, you know, this miracle with KIPP schools. We've done a study on KIPP, and you know, in the documentary, he cites a number of statistics, and I don't question them. Many of the students who graduate do go on to college and are successful. But what he doesn't tell, and again, it's his personal journaling, his personal story, his personal choice to leave out a lot of the real facts, the relevant context, is that in our study, we showed that between grades 6 and 8, 40% of the African American males leave the schools. There's so many students that are leaving that by the time that cohort gets to the 12th grade, you know, there are very small cohorts that are left. And yes, they do graduate, but so many kids are pushed out. Is that a successful model? We need to look at the full context, but you can regurgitate some facts, and it's his personal journey, his personal choice, but it's not representative. And the purpose of this, as you even said at the beginning, was there is a purpose behind this. It's to promote this idea that private entrepreneurial education is going to be more innovative and successful. And it's really successful just for those people who are profiting from it, and from parents, and also for some parents who make good choices.
Yeah, see, again, now there's research to counter exactly what you said. So if we want to talk about charter schools, or we want to talk about private schools, and then say that really the people who benefit from it are the ones who own it or run it, there is a lot of the highest quality random assignments research. There's other research that comes close to that, quasi-experimental, that shows, for instance, that kids who go to charter schools, when you compare them to like kids as best you can, do better.
That's not accurate. We're looking at effect sizes of 0.035. I assume you're citing the Stanford study. That's an effect size that's so small, it's not interpretable.
So in Detroit, it's 2 months more of learning. 2 months more of learning is not nothing.
Have they published this research?
Yes, it's the Credo
No,
study.
they have not. They've not published it as a peer review article because they cannot. It's a seriously flawed study, and I've written 2 reviews of this, and they have not published in peer-reviewed journals because of the concerns about the way they interpret effect sizes, and that they choose to interpret very, very small effect sizes. Overall, my research, and when I look at the body of research, we see them performing similarly to matched students. But we need to look at the net impact, especially with schools like KIPP on the rise, because they push out so many children. There's selective entry processes and there's selective exit processes. And they are creating schools of very homogeneous learners, but it's having a net impact, negative impact on the traditional public schools as they push out so many kids who are struggling, and they come back to the district schools, often without funding.
And again, that is certainly one way to interpret the research, but there's also research that shows when there's more choice of private schools, more choice of charter schools, it actually puts competitive pressures on public schools to improve. And some of this is peer-reviewed research. This is not just somebody puts it out there, and maybe you think they're afraid to put it in peer-reviewed journals. A lot of this is top-quality research. Again, and the point here, as connected to the documentary, is when you talk about charter schools, when you talk about even small voucher programs, and this is a big message in this documentary, is that's not sufficient. It can help, and it can help on the margins, but most of these are not embracing free markets. It's not embracing prices. It's not embracing a freedom of schools to offer all sorts of different models. It's not open in many cases to the vast majority of students. And so when we don't see big increases in outcomes from charters or private school choice programs, a lot of what's being argued here is that's because these are often very small, very hamstrung programs. And Andrew Coulson doesn't say that, well, charter schools, that's the ultimate model and that's sufficient. In fact, much of what this is about is why the charter school model is not sufficient.
So this does not discount public schools. In fact, it sounds like it's an effort to try to improve the quality of public schools through competition, if you were, with charter schools. Do you think that's an effective model that could help improve public schools?
In our research, when we look at these charter school reforms, there's the thinking behind the privatization is there's two models basically. One is that we will create competition, and through competition, we're going to lift all boats, and the public schools will respond to that competition. What the research, there are some studies that they're mixed. The most comprehensive study I've seen is here in Michigan, looking at metropolitan Detroit. And after 7% of the population leaves these schools for schools of choice or charter schools, what we see in the traditional public schools is that they go into a negative spiral. But the other approach, and what we saw in Delaware and Connecticut, these are smaller charter school reforms, and they focus on the quality charter schools. And the model and the thinking behind those reforms is more like the charter schools will be the R&D centers. They'll be innovative and freed of and autonomous and freed from some of the regulations. They will create ideas that can be shared with traditional public schools, and in that way lift all boats. So I think there's a theory behind the two approaches that suggests that the use of market mechanisms and competition can improve public schools. It just hasn't. There's not a body of empirical evidence to support these theoretical arguments that largely come from economics.
So Dr. Miran, I have a question about the difference in scale between Sweden and the United States. And I know that a lot of this push with the government is towards the charter schools and having the states have choices. The United States is enormous, and Sweden is essentially, it could be considered the size of one state. Do you think from a national perspective that the charter school and the free market concept could work in all different states if the states all had their choices?
The empirical evidence isn't there to support that. In Sweden, what's more important than just saying the size of the country is looking at the proportion of competition with the private schools. And in Sweden, again, some of the facts in this documentary, and I would call them falsehoods. I don't say they're lies because I think Andrew didn't have access to the facts, but his talk and conversation about the Vasa ship and using that as an anecdote, some of that wasn't factual. The facts about Sweden and the proportion of kids is actually much higher in the private schools than he reported. But Sweden has, in the upper secondary school level, the gymnasium, they have close to half of the students now are in privately operated schools that receive voucher money. So they have quite a market exposure to choice. But when we look at the choice markets, we have markets, smaller markets in districts and communities like Washington, D.C. or Detroit or Flint, Michigan, or New Orleans, especially where over 75% of the kids are in choice schools. So that we have similar things that we can compare with Sweden in terms of the amount of exposure or the amount of competition. And again, the lessons from Sweden I think are relevant. Here in Michigan, we can see where Michigan is one of the states who's taken a charter school reform direction that is most involved in privatization. Today we have 91% of our more than 300 charter schools are actually privately owned and operated. And what we've seen in Michigan during that very same time is Michigan used to be a top quarter. We were in the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress. We used to be in the top quarter of the states, and now we've dropped to 41st.
Charter schools are not private schools. Charter schools are public schools. Charter schools have to follow state standards, give state tests, follow state accountability.
In theory.
Yeah, in law as well. It's
not in practice.
In law and in practice, they do have to follow these laws. And it is certainly not, I think you'd agree, it's not private school choice. Charter schools are not private schools. They may be privately managed, but they don't have the autonomy of private schools. And let's also be clear that you may not like the Credo research, and there may be higher quality research that we'll see on Michigan at some point. But again, it shows the charter schools are outperforming the traditional public schools. It's not huge. And we also have to be very clear that in a state, in a country, anywhere, and everybody's probably guilty of this who does school reform, there are myriad variables that affect how kids are doing in schools that are outside of the schools. So if we say that, well, Michigan's scores have gone down around the same time they've had more charter schools, correlation is not causation, and there's so many other variables we have to look at. But the research that we do have suggests those charter schools, even though they're not the private system that Andrew Coulson would want, that they're doing a better job than the traditional public schools.
And they're not. The research effect size for Credo is 0.035. It's so small you can't interpret it, and you shouldn't interpret it. The standard for an effect size should be 0.25 for a small effect size. And so we're looking at, there's no difference. And that's what the broader body of scholarship suggests as well. The most rigorous study on school choice or charter schools was a large study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Ed that showed that charter schools had a slight negative effect. The authors there were responsible and said the effect was too small to interpret. And that's the correct thing to do. We don't see a big difference, but when we do look at charter schools more closely, we see in place selective mechanisms for entry and exit processes. Like private schools, what we're promoting in many of these reforms is schools choosing families rather than families choosing schools.
All right, we'll take some questions from our viewers. Melissa Wilson. Public schools may have been necessary 100 years ago, but now that groups like KIPP have sprung up, are public schools obsolete?
KIPP is not a scalable model. Because so many kids are pushed out, they have an admissions test and many of their things that they call a placement test. So it's not open to all children. It's an admirable company or organization that goes into high poverty communities, but they have selective entry processes. And because so many children are pushed out of the program in those initial years, it doesn't provide a scalable model. If it was a scalable model, and if it was a model that could function like a traditional public school, they would be eager to take over some of the struggling public schools. In fact, KIPP has taken over one traditional public school. It was struggling in Denver. It was called Cole Middle School. That school, KIPP was required to have the same enrollment policies and catchment areas, and they were also required to take students that come during the middle of the school year. They had children with disabilities. They had children with disciplinary problems. They had all kinds of children. And after 2 years, KIPP failed at that school. Since then, many urban communities have seen the information on KIPP. It's so exciting, so wonderful. We want Detroit and here in Michigan has also asked KIPP to come in. KIPP has politely said no, they don't do public schools. They do charter schools. And charter schools, they can benefit in their model from the selective entry and exit processes. So yes, it's successful for the students who come and persist, but it's not a model that can be scalable for all children because it's dependent on keeping those children who are slow or not able to handle the rigor out. It's also dependent on having children with disabilities being served by traditional public schools.
What we're getting is this sense that, well, charter schools and KIPP in particular can push kids out, and they're selective about who they take. First of all, legally, they cannot be selective about who they take. There's a lottery to get in. Now, there could be, and I've heard this argument many times, that, well, they certainly give the impression to many kids, though, this is not right for you. The other thing is, let's not pretend that public schools, in many cases, are not selective. The selection is, if you can afford to buy a house in a district, well, then they'll take you. And so we see huge inequality in traditional public schooling because the choice is, if I've got enough money to buy a house in a good district, then I get to go to that school. It's also worth remembering we have some traditional public schools, well, maybe I shouldn't say traditional, but magnet schools, which are public schools, which explicitly give tests that say if you don't do X, Y, or Z, you don't hit this bar in this test, you can't come in. So is KIPP going to replace public schools? Certainly not. Can private autonomous schools replace public schools? Certainly not in the near term. People need to become accustomed to being customers. Schools have to be accustomed to becoming autonomous. But it can happen that you have widespread, large-scale provision of education where that provision is private.
Thank you. All right, and next from Reginald Webb. In a school choice regime, would private schools be allowed to reject problem applicants, such as those with behavioral issues or disabilities? Dr. Miran?
Yeah, I mean, in practice, even in the voucher reforms that we see, the private schools retain the ability to to say no to applicants, and so they choose families that are more likely to succeed. They provide supportive. They provide places for supportive parents and so forth. In Sweden, we saw for a long time that voucher reform. They're not only also required parents to pay a sizable fund on top of what the government was paying to those schools. They've since removed those private fees, but it's often not everybody's going to get a place there. And of course, what we see in the voucher reforms in the USA is many of the elite-oriented schools choose not to participate in the voucher reforms because it's going to bring in children of diverse backgrounds, including low-income or minority students.
It's also really important to note that often the voucher is pretty small, much smaller usually than is spent per pupil in the public schools. And we also need to remember that public schools do not take every child with disabilities. First of all, each individual public school often takes very few. And sometimes kids have disabilities that are specific, very hard to deal with, and it's paid for them to go to a private school that can meet their needs. So that is actually sort of a voucher system where we say the public will supply enough money that we can afford to get the services that this child needs, but the public doesn't provide those services, a private institution does.
The largest portion of children with severe and moderate disabilities are being served in traditional public schools. A few states do have arrangements for children with extreme disabilities that require very expensive remediation to get private services or hospital-like provisions and supports. A few states also do have vouchers for children with disabilities, but overall, the numbers of children with disabilities, especially those with severe and moderate disabilities, they are in traditional public schools, and all schools have to take them. Neil's right, though, in an individual school doesn't have to, but within a school district, they are required to provide a place and a free and appropriate education for all children that come between the school years, or if they leave their charter schools in the middle of the year, the public school still has to create a place for them. Not necessarily at every individual schools, but they can group the students based on their disability so they can more efficiently provide those services. But they cannot say no to a child with a disability.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Dr. Neil McCluskey of the Cato Institute for joining us to discuss the film. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And Dr. Gary Miran of Western Michigan University for offering his critique.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Heather Godwin, and we'll see you next time.